In the ancient world, there stood a building that contained the sum of human knowledge. A place where scholars from across the Mediterranean gathered to unlock the secrets of the universe. This was the Great Library of Alexandria, and its destruction may have set back human civilization by centuries. Imagine, if you will, walking through corridors lined with hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Texts on mathematics that wouldn't be rediscovered for 1,000 years. Medical treatises that could have prevented plagues. Astronomical calculations that might have launched humanity to the stars centuries earlier than we achieved. This is the story of what we lost and what might have been. Our story begins in 335 BCE, in the newly founded city of Alexandria, Egypt. Alexander the Great had died just 12 years earlier, and his vast empire was being divided among his generals. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, had claimed Egypt as his prize. But Ptolemy had a vision that went far beyond conquest. He dreamed of creating something unprecedented in human history, a universal library that would gather all knowledge from every corner of the known world. Picture ancient Alexandria, a bustling port city where the Mediterranean meets the Nile Delta. Ships arrive daily from Greece, carrying philosophers fleeing the chaos of the mainland. From Mesopotamia came scholars bearing cuneiform tablets containing millennia of accumulated wisdom. Indian mathematicians brought revolutionary concepts of zero and infinity. And from the far reaches of the known world, travelers carried texts written in dozens of languages. Ptolemy established not just a library, but an entire institution of learning, the Museion, or Shrine of the Muses. It was the world's first university, where scholars could dedicate their lives entirely to research and discovery. No teaching responsibilities, no political obligations, just pure, unfettered pursuit of knowledge. The library's collection policy was breathtakingly ambitious. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched, not for contraband, but for books. Any scroll or text found would be confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and then, sometimes, the copy would be returned to the owner while the original remained in Alexandria. But this was just the beginning. Ptolemy and his successors sent agents across the known world with one mission: acquire every text ever written. They purchased entire private libraries, they commissioned translations of works from every language, they even borrowed the official state copies of the great Greek tragedies from Athens, promising to return them after copying. Instead, they kept the originals and sent back the copies, willingly forfeiting their enormous deposit. Nothing was too obscure, too foreign, or too ancient to escape their attention. Within the marble halls of the library, a constellation of brilliant minds gathered. These weren't just collectors of knowledge, they were creators of it. And what they discovered in those ancient halls would have transformed our world, had it survived. Let me tell you about Aristarchus of Samos. In the 3rd century BCE, nearly 1800 years before Copernicus, this Greek astronomer proposed something radical: that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Using ingenious geometric methods, he even attempted to calculate the size of the Sun and its distance from Earth. His calculations were remarkable for their time, and while not perfectly accurate, they demonstrated an understanding of cosmic scales that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. But here's what's truly staggering. Aristarchus didn't work in isolation. His heliocentric model was debated, refined, and built upon by other scholars in the library. If this knowledge had been preserved and developed, if the institutional momentum had continued, humanity might have had a scientific revolution in the 3rd century BCE instead of the 16th century CE. Then there was Eratosthenes, the man who measured the earth with nothing but shadows and brilliant reasoning. Around 240 BCE, He noticed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in the city of Syene, casting no shadow. But in Alexandria, 700 kilometers to the north, vertical objects cast shadows at the same time. Using the geometry he'd learned in the library's vast collection of mathematical texts, Eratosthenes calculated that this shadow represented about 1/50th of a circle. Therefore, he reasoned, the distance between Alexandria and Syene must be 1/50th of the Earth's circumference. His final calculation? The Earth's circumference was approximately 40,000 kilometers. He was off by less than 2%. But imagine if this geographical knowledge had been combined with the advanced shipbuilding techniques also preserved in the library. Maritime expeditions with accurate understanding of Earth's size could have led to systematic exploration centuries before Columbus. The Americas might have been reached by Mediterranean civilizations in the 1st century CE instead of the 15th. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, created the world's first steam engine, not as a toy or curiosity, but as a functioning mechanical device that could perform work. His eolipile used steam pressure to rotate a sphere, demonstrating the fundamental principles that would later power the Industrial Revolution. But Hero's achievement wasn't isolated. The library contained extensive collections on mechanics, hydraulics, and engineering from across the ancient world. Hero had access to descriptions of Chinese water-powered machinery, Persian windmills, and Egyptian construction techniques. He was synthesizing knowledge from dozens of civilizations. What if this mechanical knowledge had been preserved and developed? What if the economic conditions had been right for widespread adoption? Steam-powered ships could have revolutionized trade and exploration. Steam-powered manufacturing could have transformed society, a millennium before it actually occurred. Perhaps most remarkably, there was Hipparchus, often called the father of trigonometry. In the 2nd century BCE, he didn't just develop trigonometric functions. He created mathematical models that could predict celestial events with stunning accuracy. Using the library's astronomical records from Babylon, Egypt, and Greece, records spanning centuries, he discovered the precession of the equinoxes. This was a feat of mathematical sophistication that required understanding cycles lasting 26,000 years. Hipparchus essentially discovered that the Earth wobbles like a spinning top, causing the apparent position of stars to shift gradually over millennia. But here's what's breathtaking to consider. Hipparchus had access to astronomical observations from multiple civilizations, compiled over hundreds of years. Chinese astronomers had been recording supernovas and comets. Babylonian mathematicians had developed sophisticated numerical systems. Egyptian priests had tracked the flooding of the Nile in relation to stellar positions. If this astronomical knowledge had been preserved and continued to develop, if successive generations of scholars had built upon Hipparchus's work with the library's vast resources, humanity might have developed precise navigation, accurate calendars, and even early concepts of universal gravitation centuries before Newton. The library wasn't just preserving Greek knowledge, it was creating the world's first truly international scientific community. Indian numerals and decimal systems were being translated into Greek. Chinese mechanical devices were being studied and improved. Persian astronomical instruments were being refined with Greek geometric principles. This cross-pollination of ideas from different civilizations, this is how revolutionary breakthroughs happen. And it was all happening in Alexandria, until it wasn't. Deep within the library's medical section lay knowledge that could have prevented some of history's greatest tragedies. While medieval Europe was still attributing disease to evil spirits and bad air, ancient physicians in Alexandria were conducting systematic anatomical studies and developing treatments based on empirical observation. Herophilus, working in the 3rd century BCE, performed the first systematic dissections of human cadavers. This wasn't crude butchery. This was scientific anatomy. He identified the nervous system, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves. He described the heart's 4 chambers and understood its role in circulation. He mapped the brain's ventricles and theorized about their connection to intelligence. But Herophilus wasn't working alone. The library contained medical texts from every major civilization. Egyptian embalming techniques that revealed internal anatomy, Indian surgical procedures, Persian pharmaceutical knowledge, Chinese acupuncture charts showing detailed understanding of the body's systems. Erasistratus, Herophilus's contemporary, took this anatomical knowledge even further. He theorized that arteries and veins serve different functions in circulation. He understood that the heart acted as a pump. He even proposed that diseases could be caused by blockages in blood vessels, a concept that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. Now imagine, if this medical knowledge had been preserved and developed, if the systematic study of anatomy had continued, if the library's international network had allowed for the rapid sharing of medical discoveries. The Black Death, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, might have been prevented or controlled. The library contained detailed descriptions of quarantine procedures used during ancient plagues. Chinese texts described inoculation techniques for preventing smallpox. Islamic physicians had written extensively about surgical sanitation. But the loss goes deeper than just medical techniques. The library contained pharmacological knowledge that represented thousands of years of careful observation. Egyptian papyri described the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants. Indian texts contained detailed formulations for treating everything from infection to mental illness. Persian scholars had documented the therapeutic effects of specific minerals and compounds. Modern pharmaceutical companies spend billions of dollars screening natural compounds for medicinal properties. The Library of Alexandria contained the results of this screening process, conducted over millennia by civilizations across the ancient world. Plants that took us decades to identify as cancer treatments. Compounds that we're still discovering have antibiotic properties. All of this knowledge was sitting on those shelves. Consider this remarkable case. The library contained detailed accounts of cataract surgery being performed in ancient India. Not crude attempts, but sophisticated procedures using specialized instruments. These techniques were refined and documented over generations. Yet in medieval Europe, cataracts were considered incurable curses. Millions of people lived in darkness because the knowledge to cure them had been lost. The library also housed extensive psychological and psychiatric knowledge. Ancient Greek physicians had identified and described what we now call depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. They had developed therapeutic approaches based on careful observation of patients. Some of these approaches, involving diet, exercise, social support, and what we might call primitive cognitive therapy, were remarkably sophisticated. If this psychological knowledge had been preserved, if the understanding of mental health had continued to develop, how many of history's tragic figures might have received help instead of being labeled as possessed or cursed? The library's medical collection wasn't just theoretical. Alexandria was a major trade hub, meaning diseases from across the known world passed through the city. The physicians working there had practical experience treating conditions that European doctors wouldn't encounter for centuries. They understood tropical diseases, nutritional deficiencies, and endemic conditions from Africa, Asia, and beyond. This practical experience, combined with the theoretical knowledge from multiple civilizations, created a medical understanding that was centuries ahead of its time. And all of this life-saving knowledge was reduced to ash. In the mathematics section of the library lay computational techniques and theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, and some that we're still uncovering today. Apollonius of Perga developed the mathematics of conic sections to a degree of sophistication that seems almost impossible for his era. Working with the library's vast collection of geometric texts from multiple civilizations, he discovered properties of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas that would later prove essential for understanding planetary motion. But here's what's remarkable. Apollonius wasn't just doing abstract mathematics. He was working alongside astronomers who were using these curves to model celestial mechanics. The library contained Babylonian astronomical records going back centuries, Chinese observations of planetary positions, Egyptian calculations of solar and lunar cycles. If Apollonius's mathematical techniques had been combined with this astronomical data and preserved, if successive generations had built upon this work, Kepler's laws of planetary motion might have been discovered in the 2nd century BCE instead of the 17th century CE. And with accurate models of planetary motion, precise navigation becomes possible. Accurate calendars become standard. The foundation for understanding gravity and mechanics emerges centuries early. The library also contained advanced mathematical techniques from India, including early versions of calculus concepts. Indian mathematicians had developed methods for calculating areas under curves and working with infinite series. These techniques were being translated and studied in Alexandria, combined with Greek geometric rigor. Imagine if this mathematical synthesis had continued. Calculus, developed in the 3rd century BCE instead of the 17th century CE. The mathematics needed for advanced physics, engineering, and astronomy, available to ancient scholars. But perhaps most tantalizing of all, the library contained computational methods that hint at early mechanical calculation. Hero of Alexandria didn't just build steam engines. He created programmable mechanical devices that could perform sequences of operations automatically. These weren't simple toys. They were sophisticated machines that demonstrated understanding of gear ratios, mechanical advantage, and what we might call primitive programming. If this mechanical knowledge had been preserved and developed, if the mathematical techniques for optimization and calculation had continued to advance, mechanical computers might have emerged in the ancient world. Contrary to popular belief, the Library of Alexandria didn't burn in a single catastrophic fire. Its destruction was far more tragic. A slow decline over centuries as the ancient world transformed and knowledge was gradually abandoned, dispersed, or simply forgotten. The first major blow came in 48 BC during Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria. Caesar's forces, besieged in the harbour district, set fire to their own ships to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread to nearby buildings, including part of the library's collection stored in warehouses near the docks. But this wasn't the end. Roman historian Dio Cassius estimated that around 40,000 scrolls were lost in Caesar's fire. A devastating blow, but the library still contained hundreds of thousands of texts, What made this loss particularly tragic was the nature of what burned. The warehouse stored duplicates and texts waiting to be catalogued, including many unique works that had recently arrived from distant lands. Imagine entire philosophical schools from India, mathematical techniques from Persia, engineering secrets from China, all turned to ash before they could be properly studied and integrated into the library's collection. The library limped on, but the Roman Empire's changing priorities gradually starved it of resources. The Ptolemaic dynasty had treated the library as a crown jewel, pouring enormous resources into acquiring and maintaining texts. But to Roman administrators, Alexandria was just another provincial city, and the library was an expensive luxury. Funding for copying text dried up. Scribes found other work. The aggressive acquisition policy ended. Without constant copying, ancient papyri began to decay in Egypt's humidity. Without new acquisitions, the collection stopped growing just as the world was expanding. In the 3rd century CE, Emperor Caracalla's persecution of Alexandrian intellectuals scattered many scholars. They fled with whatever text they could carry, but the vast majority of the collection remained, slowly crumbling. The rise of Christianity brought new challenges. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. The Serapeum, which housed part of the library's collection, was attacked by Christian mobs led by Archbishop Theophilus. But we must be careful about assigning blame here. The destruction wasn't driven by anti-intellectual sentiment, but by religious and political upheaval. Many Christian scholars actually tried to preserve ancient texts, recognizing their value. The loss was more about changing priorities and social chaos than deliberate book burning. The final blow came with the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE. Again, this wasn't a deliberate act of destruction. The Arab scholars who arrived were often more interested in preserving ancient knowledge than their predecessors had been. But by this time, centuries of neglect had reduced the once mighty collection to a shadow of its former self. What remained was either absorbed into Islamic libraries, where much of it would be preserved and eventually transmitted to medieval Europe, or simply disappeared into the mists of history. But the real tragedy isn't just what was lost. It's what never had the chance to develop. The library wasn't just a storage facility. It was a research institution where knowledge from different civilizations cross-pollinated and evolved. When that stopped, when the momentum of discovery was broken, humanity lost not just ancient wisdom, but centuries of potential progress. Think about it this way. The library had been accumulating and synthesizing knowledge for over 600 years when its decline began. 6 centuries of continuous scholarship, translation, and discovery. If that momentum had continued, if the institutional framework had survived, where might we be today?
Let's delve into the specific texts and knowledge that disappeared with the library, and consider what their preservation might have meant for human development. The library contained the complete works of ancient mathematical schools that we know only by reputation today. Imagine having access to the full geometric proofs of Apollonius, not just the fragments that survived, but his complete mathematical system. Or the astronomical calculations of Hipparchus in their entirety. Every observation, every computational method, every theoretical framework. We know that the library housed detailed accounts of Chinese inventions, paper-making techniques, advanced metallurgy, magnetic compass designs, and gunpowder formulations. But these weren't just descriptions, they were comprehensive technical manuals written by practitioners who understood both the theory and practice of these technologies. If this knowledge had been preserved in the Mediterranean world, If it had been available to Roman engineers and later European craftsmen, the technological timeline of human civilization would have been completely different. Consider navigation alone. The library contained detailed maps and sailing instructions from Phoenician traders who had explored beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It housed Chinese texts describing the use of magnetic compasses for sea navigation. It contained Indian mathematical techniques for calculating position using celestial observations. Combine all of this knowledge, accurate maps, magnetic navigation, and precise astronomical calculation, and you have the foundation for reliable ocean exploration. Not the dangerous hit-or-miss voyages of discovery that characterized the age of exploration, but systematic, scientific maritime expansion. The medical knowledge was equally comprehensive. The library contained surgical texts from India describing cataract removal, kidney stone extraction, and even primitive plastic surgery techniques. It housed Chinese medical theories about circulation and organ function. It preserved Egyptian knowledge of anatomy gained from centuries of mummification. But perhaps most valuable were the pharmacological texts. The library contained detailed catalogues of medicinal plants from across the known world, not just their names and uses, but careful descriptions of preparation methods, dosages, and combinations. This represented thousands of years of careful experimentation and observation. Modern ethnobotanists estimate that traditional medicine around the world has identified therapeutic properties in over 50,000 plant species. The Library of Alexandria contained documented knowledge of plants from Africa, Asia, Europe, and beyond, representing a significant portion of humanity's accumulated pharmacological wisdom. The engineering and technological texts were equally remarkable. The library housed descriptions of Roman concrete that could set underwater and lasted for centuries. It contained Persian techniques for underground water systems that could irrigate desert regions. It preserved Chinese knowledge of steel production and metallurgy. Hero of Alexandria's works on mechanical devices hint at what else might have been preserved. He described not just steam engines but coin-operated vending machines, automatic door opening systems, and programmable theatrical devices that could perform complex sequences of movements. These weren't science fiction, they were working devices based on sophisticated understanding of mechanics, hydraulics, and what we might call early automation. If this technological knowledge had been preserved and developed, if the economic and social conditions had supported its expansion, the Industrial Revolution might have begun in the ancient world. The agricultural texts were perhaps most immediately practical. The library contained farming techniques from the Nile Delta, crop rotation methods from Mesopotamia, and irrigation systems from Persia. It housed detailed breeding records for livestock and seed varieties adapted to different climates. Ancient agriculture was far more sophisticated than we often realize. The library preserved knowledge of fertilization techniques, pest control methods, and soil management that took European agriculture centuries to redevelop. If this agricultural knowledge had been preserved and disseminated, the famines that plagued medieval Europe might have been prevented. But perhaps the most tantalizing loss was in the realm of geography and exploration. The library contained accounts of expeditions beyond the known world, descriptions of lands that wouldn't be officially discovered for centuries. There were accounts of expeditions down the African coast, possibly reaching modern-day Kenya or Tanzania. There were descriptions of voyages into the Atlantic that hint at knowledge of distant lands. Some scholars believe the library contained accounts of Phoenician expeditions that may have reached the Americas.
While we must be cautious about making extraordinary claims, what's certain is that the ancient world was far more connected and far more knowledgeable about global geography than we often assume. And much of this knowledge was concentrated in Alexandria.
Let's engage in a thought experiment. Imagine the Library of Alexandria had never declined. Imagine its institutional momentum had continued. Its international network had expanded, and its vast collection had been preserved and built upon for another 1,000 years. By the year 1000 CE, instead of medieval Europe struggling with basic arithmetic, Mediterranean scholars might have been working with advanced calculus, developed from Indian and Greek mathematical traditions. Instead of crude alchemy, they might have had systematic chemistry based on centuries of careful experimentation. Picture this alternate timeline. Steam-powered ships, developed from Hero's engines and Chinese mechanical knowledge, regularly crossing the Atlantic by the 8th century. The Americas aren't discovered in 1492. They're systematically explored and mapped 500 years earlier. Medical knowledge that took Europe until the 19th century to develop. Surgical techniques, understanding of circulation, systematic anatomy. All of this exists by the 6th century CE. The plagues that devastated medieval populations are prevented or controlled using quarantine methods and treatments preserved from ancient texts. Agricultural techniques that supported population growth in the ancient world continue to develop and spread. The agricultural revolution that preceded the Industrial Revolution happens a millennium earlier. Population growth supports larger scholarly communities, more resources for research, and faster technological development. But the implications go far beyond individual technologies. The preservation of Alexandria's institutional model, the idea of international scholarly cooperation, systematic research, and knowledge accumulation could have fundamentally changed how human civilization developed. Instead of knowledge being hoarded by isolated scholars or lost during political upheavals, imagine a continuous tradition of scientific investigation spanning continents and centuries. Chinese innovations immediately shared with Mediterranean scholars. Indian mathematical discoveries rapidly integrated with Greek theoretical frameworks. Persian engineering techniques combined with Roman organizational methods. This kind of systematic international knowledge sharing didn't really emerge again until the modern era. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was remarkable, partly because it re-established the kind of international scholarly community that had existed.
But imagine if that community had never been broken. Imagine 1500 years of continuous scientific development, of knowledge building upon knowledge without the interruption of dark ages and lost wisdom. By our present day, in this alternate timeline, humanity might have reached the stars centuries ago. We might have solved the challenges of sustainable energy, climate control, and space travel, using knowledge that built steadily over 2 millennia. The social and political implications are equally staggering. The library represented an ideal of universal knowledge, the idea that wisdom belonged to all humanity, not just to particular nations or religious groups. If this ideal had been preserved and institutionalized, if international scholarly cooperation had continued to develop, how different might human history have been? Wars fought over ideology might have been replaced by collaborative research projects. Resources spent on destruction might have been invested in discovery. The tribalism that has characterized so much of human history might have been tempered by a shared commitment to advancing knowledge for all humanity. Of course, this is speculation. We cannot know what would have actually happened. But what we can know is this: the loss of Alexandria represents one of the greatest setbacks in human intellectual history.
As we reflect on the loss of Alexandria, we cannot ignore the parallels to our own time. Today, we live in an era of unprecedented knowledge creation and storage, but also of unprecedented fragility. Our digital libraries contain vastly more information than Alexandria ever did. The internet has created a global network of knowledge sharing that would have amazed ancient scholars. We can access research from every corner of the world instantaneously. But consider how fragile this system is. Digital storage requires constant maintenance, regular migration to new formats, and continuous electrical power. A solar storm, cyber attack, or even simple technological obsolescence could wipe out vast swaths of human knowledge overnight. The Library of Alexandria took centuries to decline. Our digital knowledge could disappear in minutes. We're already seeing warning signs. Websites vanish when hosting fees aren't paid. Digital archives become inaccessible when file formats become obsolete. Cloud storage services shut down, taking irreplaceable data with them. But there's another, more subtle parallel. Ancient Alexandria succeeded because it brought together knowledge from different civilizations and scholarly traditions. Its strength lay in synthesis, in combining insights from Greek logic, Egyptian practical knowledge, Persian engineering, Indian mathematics, and Chinese innovation. Today, despite our global connectivity, academic knowledge is increasingly siloed. Researchers in different fields rarely communicate. National and linguistic barriers still prevent knowledge sharing. Proprietary research is locked away in corporate laboratories. We have the technical capability to create something even greater than the Library of Alexandria, a truly global, collaborative knowledge system that builds on the insights of all human cultures and traditions. But do we have the institutional vision and commitment? The scholars of Alexandria understood something we seem to have forgotten, that knowledge belongs to humanity as a whole, that discoveries in one culture can benefit all cultures, that the preservation and advancement of knowledge is perhaps our most important collective responsibility. Their institution lasted for nearly 7 centuries, longer than any university that exists today. What can we learn from their model? How can we build knowledge institutions that are both ambitious and durable? The answer may lie in diversity and redundancy. Alexandria fell partly because it became too centralized. Too much knowledge concentrated in one place. Our digital age offers the opportunity to distribute knowledge widely while still maintaining global access. But we must also commit to preservation with the same dedication that ancient Alexandria showed to acquisition. We need institutions that will maintain and protect human knowledge across centuries, regardless of political upheavals, technological changes, or economic pressures. The Library of Alexandria is gone. But its legacy survives in every scientific discovery, every medical breakthrough, every technological innovation that builds on the foundation of human knowledge. Some of Alexandria's wisdom did survive. Islamic scholars preserved many Greek texts during Europe's Dark Ages. Byzantine libraries maintained copies of classical works. Fragments and references in later texts give us glimpses of what was lost. But imagine if none of it had been lost. Imagine if the momentum of discovery had never been broken. Imagine if the vision of universal knowledge had been realized and sustained. We cannot recover what was lost in ancient Alexandria, but we can honor its memory by building something even greater. We can create knowledge institutions that bring together the best insights from all human cultures. We can commit to preserving and sharing wisdom across generations. We can ensure that future historians never have to write about the great digital libraries that were lost, because we had the wisdom to learn from Alexandria's fate. The dream of universal knowledge, the vision of a world where wisdom is preserved and shared freely. This dream didn't die with the Library of Alexandria. It lives on, waiting for us to make it real.